So I'm Don Pfister, and I'm here as part of the Mycological History Project that was organized by Meredith Blackwell.
I'm Meredith Blackwell.
And we're continuing today with the project, and we're very happy to have Joyce Longcore here to talk to us. So, Joyce, do you want to introduce yourself a bit? You're from University of Maine.
I'm Joyce Longcore. I'm an associate research professor at the University of Maine. They consider me a person of interest because I'm not on the staff. I'm not paid, but I do have. They generously have allowed me to keep my lab.
And you may be one of the highest profile people in your department.
Which I think it's the papers that have been cited multiple times that have kept my lab for me.
Oh, that's great.
I'm sure.
That's great.
I'm sure you help them more than they help you.
We've often started these with thinking about how you got started, and I know that your career has been one that you got started, took time off, and then took off.
Yes, you might say that. I went to. Let's start a little earlier.
Let's start with where were you born?
I was born in a small town in Michigan. Lived on a farm the first 9 years.
What were you near? What town?
And at that time, I was near the town of South Haven, Michigan. And South Haven, Michigan
Is that near Grand Rapids?
Is south of Grand Rapids.
Because I lived in Holland for 6 years.
That's right, you
I
did.
know. I tend to forget it.
We were just a little bit south of Holland, and South Haven is. And I went to high school there, but as I say, I started out on a farm, and we fished in the creek, and we were allowed to be gone for a half a day at a time, and that sort of a background. And my father, after being a farmer, was a carpenter, and his family had been in town for generations, and we didn't know we weren't high-class people. I mean, because
you were like everyone else.
We were like everybody else. And my brother went to college for a couple of years, but I went to the University of Michigan and actually graduated from the University of Michigan.
So you were first in your family?
My mother went to 2 years of business school, but I was the first family for a four-year degree. Yeah.
So when you were at Michigan as an undergraduate, did you do biology?
I was a biology major, and because my dad thought I should have some way to earn a living, I also took education course or two so that I could become a teacher. But I was never really interested in becoming a teacher. So late in my senior year, first of all, you're going to want to know about Dr. Fred Sparrow.
Yeah.
And I took plant morphology course from him. And then I went to the University of Michigan Biological Station in '58 and took aquatic flowering plants, which is another
Ed Voss.
No, I took it from Fred Sparrow.
Oh, Fred did that then.
Yes,
okay.
Dr. Sparrow taught aquatic flowering plants. And by the time I was a senior, he said, do you want to work for me next year as a research assistant sort of person?
Did that mean going to grad school too?
And what I did was I wasn't in an official grad program, but I took a couple courses. I took some more chemistry, and I took an entomology course. And so that I did that for a year, and then I got accepted into Indiana University and went with Bob Johns, who had been Sparrow's
Right.
student, was my major
He
professor at
studied
Indiana.
Ganopodia, or
He did have that paper on Ganopodia.
that he ended up being co-author with Benjamin,
Right.
with Dick Benjamin, because
Right.
they had the same project. Huh?
They discovered sexuality in Ganopodia at the same time, and instead of doing rival papers or anything, they did a
it
joint
together.
paper.
Do you know how they decided who would be first author?
No, I don't.
I've always wondered.
Yeah.
I've always wondered.
So, thinking about Fred Sparrow, we need to go back to your life story, but we're kind of on Sparrow at this point. I knew him also from the field station in Pellston. And I went there in 1967 in the summer and took the aquatic phycomycetes, I guess we called them still then, and also aquatic flowering plants. Ed Voss was teaching the aquatic flowering plants, and Sparrow's student, Patterson, was teaching the aquatic phycomycetes. And Fred Sparrow was acting director of the station.
Right.
And the station was such an interesting place. You know, the community that developed. You know, you lived in cabins with
And we all ate together.
We all ate together, and we rotated tables, and you were assigned to tables that you needed to do, and you were assigned to faculty tables. It wasn't just
there were faculties hosting the tables.
Yeah, and you know, it wasn't particularly formal, but you ended up thinking, oh, I know I'm going to rotate and have that faculty member, some such thing. I mean, you know, how's that going to be? But it was a really wonderful community, and later I went back again and took the mushroom course that Smith was teaching. And I did something else. I did lichens there as well. Howard Crum was teaching lichens.
Yes.
But a great little community. But you know, I kind of felt that I got to know Fred Sparrow a bit in that. And then he came and visited the Farlow in 76 or something like that. I was just a young assistant professor, and he had done his PhD at Harvard with Thaxter.
Cap Weston.
Weston and Thaxter both, I think, were involved with it. But he told some funny stories about his time there. One of them being that he was an undergraduate at Dartmouth, and he had ridden down for his interview or something at Harvard, and had ended up on the smoking car coming down to Boston, and he went to see Thaxter, and a very formal guy, went into his office, and Thaxter said, "Ah, the nicotine." He'd been in the smoking car all day. But anyway, he came to the Farlow because he wanted to, at that later date, because he wanted to collect information about DeBerry. And Farlow had been DeBerry's student, and so he looked at letters and he did a lot of work and ended up giving us his archive on DeBerry after he'd finished that, which he was doing for his address for the Second International Mycological Congress that was in 1977 in Florida.
Florida.
Tampa.
Yeah.
And what he told me previous to that conference is, he says, I'm going to get it all written out, and if I start, my mental capacities decrease, you can shove me right up to that podium and I'll read it. I mean, he was really looking forward to doing it, and he wanted to make sure it was done
well,
right.
he died shortly after that.
Right. He stayed alive for this.
Now, not too long before that, I guess, he was in Florida, and I was working in Jim Kimbrough's lab. And Sparrow showed up one day. Well, I wasn't privy to the fact that he might have announced he was coming. But I was assigned to take him out to this swampy area where there were some boardwalks, and he wanted to collect sphagnum, and I'm sure that was as a chytrid habitat. So anyway, I take him over these things, and they were bouncy and wet, and he had on this absolutely gorgeous, pristine blue seersucker suit, jacket, tie, white shirt, pants. And so we go out in this place, and he gets mud splattered all over, and I felt so awful, but he wasn't too unhappy. So, but he was a nice man, because when I was at Hope College, he offered, when he saw me using the library, and I didn't know he knew who I was, and he came over and said, "What are you doing?" He said, "Anytime you need anything from the library, just let me know and I'll send it."
Yeah.
Really kind.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
after he died, his wife got in touch with me to see if I wanted to buy the Lovell series books from Pfister's. Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh.
The other funny story, and it's your interview, but
Yeah.
I tell this.
Talk all you want.
I tell this story every time I'm teaching, and I mention the Monoblepharidales, because that was his PhD at Harvard. And Pfister had worked on some of these early on in the 1890s. And Sparrow told the story to me when he was there visiting that this was kind of his assigned thesis. He was going to work on this. And so he went out looking, trying to collect these, and he couldn't find them, and he couldn't find them, and he looked, and finally he said to Thaxter, "I can't find these." And Thaxter said, "Well, you ride the trolley up to Arlington, and there's this little pond, and you go to the south corner, and there's some sticks in there. And if you look at those sticks, you're going to find the Monoblepharis." And so he did it, and there it was. And his sequel to that is he said, "I know that he wasn't there for the last 50 years. You know, he just knew this habitat and could send him off there to find it." So, but anyway, he was full of stories and full of information about that. So how did you, so you're in Indiana. We left you in Indiana.
I was in Indiana, left to get married. But that was not the end of my association with Sparrow, which I left Michigan, because, let's see, even after I was married and we moved to Maryland, then I was close to Robert Patterson's lab. And so I worked for Sparrow in Robert Patterson's lab.
Isolated kitchens?
No, at that time, you have to remember, during my era, Sparrow was heavily involved in Physoderma.
Oh yeah.
And so, as I say, part of the reason he kept me on is, well, we got along, but I had a good eye for plants, and I had a good eye for Physoderma. And I was sent to town one day, I needed something in town one day in Sheboygan when we were at the biological station. And as an excuse to have the car, I had to go collect something. And so on my way back to the station, I stopped at a stream along, it was close to the lake, and there was a lisma growing in the stream. And I looked at it, and it was infected with Physoderma, or it looked like it had Physoderma to me, and so I collect Physoderma, or the lisma, and bring it back. And yes, it was infected. The good part of it is the type species of Physoderma is on Elisma, Physoderma maculare. And so, I earned my...
You did.
Your gas money.
because before that, the only place we'd found it was about 100 miles south of the station, and here it was right in Sheboygan.
And it was the same species.
It was, same species. and we worked at what we called Sparrow's Swale. And this was a wetland, a permanent pond. And I need to get a map to find out exactly where it is, because I want to go back if Tim has a bio blitz for fungi up there. Anyway, and it was full of different plants that were infected with Physoderma. And so I don't know, I can't imagine what it all was we did at that time from the point of view of now, when so much is lab work. But we did do surveys of where the plants were and what was infected.
Yeah.
And so then you got married, and where did you go?
We moved to Maryland.
Okay.
And and that's,
Okay, so that's when you were in
yeah,
Patterson's lab.
right.
Okay.
Yeah, and we were, and Sparrow still came. He would come to Washington D.C. That was his hometown, and
Never knew that.
and come see us. I mean, this was a family relationship with us with Sparrow. I mean, he knew my kids. We stopped to see them when we went through Ann Arbor. It was more family than anything else. But I only regret that he didn't ever get to know what happened to me, that I came back to Kittredge after all those years of being a housewife.
Not only came back, but really put it back on the stage.
but and of course we used to talk about all sorts of things, and he was an atheist. He did not believe in any afterlife.
So you can't say he's up there looking
so
down.
I'm there, and I say, I can't even wish his soul to whatever he has after you die. I can't even talk to it, you know.
Yeah.
So your husband was a biologist too?
He's a wildlife biologist.
At the time you married him, or?
Yeah. He worked at the Patuxent Wildlife Research Center in Maryland.
Yeah.
And a lot of, he testified at the closing hearing for DDT. He did research. This is not about my husband, but he did research on lead shot. They've banned lead shot. And he did some of the studies that showed that iron shot would do kill ducks just as well as lead shot. And so I was the home person, and he did the research at that time.
And so then though he got another job, the one in Maine? Or?
Right. It was still a U.S. Fish and Wildlife at that time, and he was transferred to Maine.
So it was a wildlife position, fish and wildlife. It wasn't the university.
No,
it was federal.
no, federal.
Yeah.
Federal.
But then you found your way back.
I found my way back because of the University of Michigan. The mycology teacher at Maine was at University of Michigan when I was there. It was Richard Homola. And so he knew that I was a sparrow person, that I knew about Kittredge. And so when he had a student that needed some help identifying fungi in a peat septic system, her leach field had failed. They replaced it with peat, and it had worked so well, she got an NSF grant to study the microorganisms in it. It was too much for one person, and so they got me in there to look at the aquatic fungi. And the minute I got back behind the microscope, I just said, "Oh yeah, this is what I do."
That's great.
I'd completely forgotten. It I raised kids,
Sure.
you know, but I knew it was time to get back to to doing something, because you don't want to over manage your kids when they get a certain age. And
Well, about 22 years ago, I worked at NSF for the year, and there was a group of people that some of the NSF people had organized to come in and have a small symposium. And they were talking about the death of amphibians in the world, all over the world. And so I heard these talks all day long, and then nobody mentioned anything I was really interested in. But I was talking to one of the people at the social hour afterwards, and I just casually asked, I said, has anyone looked to see if there are any fungi involved? And he looked at me and he winked. And he says, do you know Joyce Longcore? And I said, I do. And he says, well, just wait. So you come on the stage now. So what happened? Oh, and we just talked to Mel Fuller a couple of weeks ago, and Mel Fuller said that you were the one that he advised people to go to.
right, you know, so many things. It's Mel who decided to put up a web page on the zoosporic fungi, and they and I forget how I was down there for Mel's retirement or something. I don't know, but I brought pictures of some of the pictures I had of chytrids that went up on the website, and so I was semi-involved, but it was Mel that did the work. And so when at the National Zoo, when they found out, they were trying to track down what it was that they saw in their electron photomicrographs, what kind of organism it was. They found Mel's website and contacted him and said, would you look at some electron photomicrographs and tell us what you think? And so they sent them to Mel, and Mel looked at them and he sent them on to me, and I don't remember what Mel said, but by chance one of those photos had cut right through a zoosporangium with mature zoospores in it. And at that time we were using zoospore ultrastructure to get taxonomic characters. And I looked at it and I said, it's a chytrid zoospore. So as far as my part in that, I was so excited. I told Alan Pessier and Don Nichols at the National Zoo, please send me some material. I want to see this under my microscope. And they did. And the first stuff they sent me was kind of old, but I could see it, and I could see, yeah, this was, I said, okay, now send me some fresh stuff. So when they had an animal died, they sent me, it was a poison dart frog, and they just sent me a little tiny leg. And I was trying to isolate everything I was studying, and so I just used the same techniques and the same media that I usually use to isolate things. And I cleaned that little pieces of skinned, tiny pieces. I cut them up with my fingernail scissors under the microscope, and cleaned a bunch of them. And one of them, then you come back in. It takes a lot of patience. You come back in at days and you invert it on your microscope and look and see if anything's growing. And one little piece of skin had some thalli growing around it, but they just sat there. And I knew they would die if they just sat there, so I put them into broth, because some stuff will grow better in broth. And came in on October 13th, 1997. The only reason I remember the date is it was my birthday.
Oh.
And it was a weekend or something. Nobody else was around. And I looked at that flask, and it was kind of opalescent. I said, oh, geez, either there's bacteria growing
Yeah.
in there or that fungus is growing. And so I take it over to my laminar flow hood and get a sterile Pasteur pipette and take some out and put it on a slide and look at it, and it was full of BD. It was full of the chytrid. It was growing.
All the zoospores, were they zoospores?
Oh, there were
Yeah.
zoospores and
Everything.
thalli and everything.
Oh, wow.
And I got up and walked around the room for a while because there was nobody there to tell.
Well, who am I going to tell? Yeah.
You could have called up Baxter if you'd only believed in God. I mean,
But this it was exciting to me because I knew it opened the door for all kinds of research. Whereas people before had tried to isolate it, and they had ended up with Basidiobulus. Because if you throw a piece of amphibian skin on the usual kind of agar that veterinary pathologists use, whatever it is, you're going to get Basidiobulus because it's so closely associated with.
Yeah.
I sent you some once, didn't
you
I?
did.
Because what you have to remember is at the same time in the United States that we were doing this, they were doing the same thing in Australia. They didn't get it into pure culture, but they had gotten TEM, the zoospores, and they knew what they were dealing with there at the same time. Sometimes we forget to give proper recognition to other research places, but they were doing.
They were on it.
They were on it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But the fact that you had it in culture and that that you were able to cultivate it so well also opened doors.
It did. Yes. Yes. I worked on. Well, I had a graduate student that helped us figure out what media to use and what temperatures and everything, and being able to do the research. And of course, what's come out of the pure cultures is all the genetic research that has been done since then to figure out different lineages and
Right.
And the probable origin.
What are we saying the probable origin is these days?
Asia.
Asia. Okay.
Where for a
Korea-
long time there were no
Korea-
dots on the map.
Right, Korean peninsula, maybe, I don't know.
Yeah, it was Africa for a while, wasn't it?
Africa was the first place I thought of because I knew of, early on I was sent Xanthopus frogs from Africa that were freshly imported, and they had, I'm going to call it, it's Batrachochytrium dendrobatidus, but I'm going to call it BD.
Yeah.
Because I knew that Xanthopus frogs had been imported for pregnancy testing in the 30s and 40s.
It was very logical.
Yeah.
That would be
And so
those.
and these were infected, and I said, and there's not all animals are killed by BD, and Xanthopus are one of those that are carriers. And of course, the other infamous carrier is our North American bullfrog, which is farmed in places all over the world. And again, it just carries minor infections and can be transported internationally.
I was wondering, the other day I had a meal at a Chinese restaurant down the street, and they had frog legs on the menu. Is that a traditional food in China, do you know?
I don't know if it's particularly Chinese, but yeah.
But
yeah.
in Asia.
Well, okay, so Tim got one of our isolates is
That's
from
Tim James.
Tim
Yep.
James. I got it from a market in a Chinese market in.
Okay.
Yeah, it's usually Chinese markets where they pick them up. And
So they do sell the
Yeah.
frogs. Yeah. Well, I remember another study I heard about where you and your husband went along the road and picked up all the road-killed frogs and toads.
Yes, we did.
And it was profitable, huh?
Oh yeah. Well, okay. So Jerry's working for U.S. By that time it had been the research division of U.S. Fish and Wildlife had been taken into USGS. Okay, so that's what he was in then. And so he got a project to check on where BD was in the Northeast. And so a lot of it was based on our roadkill studies.
I thought that was a neat way to collect the frogs.
Well, it is, because you don't have to kill them. They're already
Yeah,
dead.
waiting.
You just have to get there soon enough.
Yeah.
Right. On a rainy night, you go out about 10 o'clock, 10, 11 o'clock, on a road that's traveled but not too traveled. And you just go along till the lights pick up a dead frog, and you stop, and then the policeman stops you, and you tell them what you're doing, and they say fine, and everybody.
They believe you.
Oh yes,
Yeah.
I mean two people our age, and
Reminds me of a funny story that one of our writers wrote about looking for a pearl necklace when the police come along. That's a story I remember from way back.
Yeah.
So one other thing I was going to mention, I once went up and had a lovely time in Maine, and you had a party. And I always tell people that, you know, in my department, everyone was so much younger than I was, that when you had a party, there were a lot of little kids around. But when I went to Joyce's house, everybody brought their dogs, and I loved it. It was really neat. So I had also heard the story that you never flew until you discovered BD and you were in much demand. Is that true?
Not exactly. I didn't travel that much, especially never internationally. Well, but Sparrow, getting back to the important things, thought that I should be educated enough, and he set it up for me to go to Washington, D.C. by myself and visit the Smithsonian and go out to the Ag Research Center in Beltsville, and I forget what I was supposed to do, look at herbarium specimens for Physoderma, probably. And so it took me to Willow Run, which is where one of the airports was at that time, and I flew to D.C. by myself, and I was probably all of 21, and and I took the bus out to Beltsville, and I took the whatever else was in D.C. and went to the Smithsonian and one thing and another. So, yeah.
So you learned to travel starting back?
I learned to travel then, but not. I didn't travel to the extent that I did once the BD.
Yeah.
When I've been to Australia a couple times and South Africa and
Yeah, well, that's
places.
real travel.
Brazil.
Yeah.
And loved it, you know, always by myself, but such kind people would pick me up.
It's funny because one of your students, one recent student, once told me I'm never going to a meeting without Joyce because everything had been gone wrong when he came to Baton Rouge to a meeting.
That meeting,
You had missed it.
Yeah,
but he even at the end, his flight was canceled.
Yeah.
So he learned to travel. He was set out on his own.
Yeah.
The EM. When did you pick up the EM, the transmission electron microscopy?
I took a course at the University of Maryland when I was there working for Sparrow and taking a course on the side, but I didn't follow up on it then because then there was the big hiatus until I went back to school. And so when I was in grad school at the University of Maine, I took an electron microscopy course, and equally as important, one of the early meetings, MSA meetings I went to when I returned, I talked about one of the chytrids I had gotten into culture. And Donald Barr invited me to come to Ottawa, and I spent a week or two in his lab, and Nicole Desilin, I can't say her last name.
I can't either.
Took me all the way through, you know, how they did their work. And so I had both a formal university course and the help from Don Barr's lab.
Yeah.
I was eternally grateful for that.
Yeah. Speaking of Donald, I heard that he left some money to the society, which was
Oh,
very kind of him. They're just receiving it now.
huh. I didn't
Yeah.
know that.
Yeah. Yeah, I saw him in England, and he'd completely given up mycology. This was about maybe 10 years ago. And he was walking
He
on
was a hiker.
trails. Yeah,
He loved to
to
hike.
keep them open. You know how they
Yeah.
have these laws about everything's open to the public as long as it's used. But he also, I didn't know, played contract bridge.
Yeah, I think
And
I
so
remember
that's
that.
what he was
Yeah.
doing
Yeah.
in England when he retired. Yeah. And at the time, that was right about the time the BD started, and he really hadn't heard of it. And I thought, oh, this is so sad, you know,
Yeah.
to work on chytrids all your life and then
Right.
not be there to break this. Anyway.
Yeah. Well, he did so much of the TEM
Yeah.
sorting and looking at these structures and trying to
Right.
use it with the classification.
And
Yeah.
it's still going on. When we have something new, we like to get some electron photomicrographs of the zoospores.
Yeah.
It's getting more complicated as we see more diversity, and the characters. Some of the early orders, some of the orders we separated out earlier had distinct. Almost all the zoospores had these ultrastructural characters, and we're finding more diversity within orders now.
The more you look at
The
it.
more
Yeah.
you look, the more complicated it
sampling,
gets.
sampling.
And I remember one of your new orders. What did you have, 6 new orders? You and several other people?
There's probably about 12 orders
12.
what used to be the Chytridiales now.
So there were 2 and then maybe 4 and now 12.
Yeah, and the most recent ones are quite interesting because Karpov, St. Petersburg, Russia,
Right.
there's 2 orders, and they're both based on algal parasites.
The aphelids?
Not
the
the
aphelids, they're
aphelids.
not.
He works
Okay.
on those too, and I can't tell you the names of the orders.
Mhm.
Gromochytriales is
Oh,
one.
yeah. Yeah, and I see they've been added to the to Wikipedia or something.
Yeah, they
His
probably
2 new
have.
orders, yeah.
Plus, there's another one that he did the zoospore ultrastructure to confirm what another Russian had put in an order. I can't go into that because I can't remember his name.
Yeah.
But yes, and there will be more. You know that my poster, this algal parasite that I've worked on for an algal agricultural growing, you know, for Hematococcus pluvialis commercially grown. It doesn't. So far the genomic analysis has not placed it in any order.
And BD hasn't been, has it? Or
No,
has
BD's in the
it is
Rhizophidiales.
Okay, it is in there. It was kind of an outlier at first, I guess, and I haven't kept up. And there was another thing that impressed me about some of your work, because you had isolated one, and I can't remember what substrate you used. You used something that was a little bit unusual, and it took you 10 years to find more of them before you described the order. Do you know what I'm talking about?
I don't know which one.
But you've done so many, so it probably happened many times. But you just had to bait over and over and with
No,
different things.
One of the interesting ones have is a syncytium, which you know is a plant pathogenic.
Yeah.
Well, I have something that falls molecularly within the syncytium genus, but it's saprobic,
Huh.
and instead of being all sorts of complicated different stages, it's a real simple chytrid. And I only had one of them when I described that, and since then I've found two more. But the only way I've found all three of them is on isolation plates when I was trying to isolate something else, and just happened to see the zoospores.
And know they're different.
And know that, and see that, yes, there's something else
So,
in
so
there.
under the light microscope, you can distinguish different species of zoospores?
Under the light microscope, if you're lucky, you can tell that. Sometimes.
And you tell it by movement, by behavior?
No. Okay, so members of the Chytridiales usually have a slightly oval zoospore, not completely round, and not all of them are that way. And members of the Rhizophidiales usually have somewhat smaller zoospores and perfectly spherical. But you know, you put these with the other information that's coming into your head rather than just the zoospore alone.
You've just got the eye.
You have the eye,
40
you have the
years.
experience. You know, part of it is having seen so much. That's part of the synthesis. What's it growing on? How did I get this? You know, how could that be here?
Yeah.
What does it look like? Yeah.
I used to give myself permission on Mondays and Fridays to spend a lot of time just looking at things. And for a person whose major contribution has been furnishing things for other people to do work on, well, that's how you do it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Is that a message that you would give to younger colleagues? Take time to look, or look at all.
Well, I have Sparrow's. I have some old notes that Sparrow had from a talk or a lecture or something, and it says, you know, talking about baiting, and it says, look, look, look. And so that's you just have, that's what you have to do.
Yeah.
You have to know what things other than chytrids look like, so that you know what is a chytrid. I mean, if you just put somebody down in front of a slide that has all sorts of things in it, how are they supposed to know what a chytrid looks like if they don't know what an alga looks like?
Yep.
Or some of the invertebrates, the protozoans and everything. Somebody that's looking for interesting things kind of has to get an eye for everything else.
Yeah.
Well, we're glad you talked to us.
Yeah. Thank you.
Was it
Wasn't
that
so
bad?
bad.
It's awful.